Margaret Chun had learned long ago that being invisible had its advantages. At 62, she moved through the corridors of the Pentagon with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 38 years navigating the labyrinthine halls of military bureaucracy. Her sensible shoes made barely a whisper against the polished floors, and her modest gray suit blended seamlessly with the shadows cast by the building's imposing architecture. Most people who passed her assumed she was just another administrative assistant, perhaps a secretary or a clerk. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. Margaret had started as a secretary, fresh out of high school in 1985, but what nobody realized was how far that journey had taken her. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Margaret arrived at her office at precisely 7:30, as she had every weekday for nearly 4 decades. She unlocked the door to what appeared to be a modest administrative suite, but behind that unremarkable entrance lay something extraordinary. Margaret Chun was the director of Strategic Military Personnel Integration, a position so classified that even its existence was known to fewer than 50 people in the entire Department of Defense. Her coffee was still steaming when the first crisis of the day landed on her desk. Colonel James Morrison, a decorated infantry officer, had been selected for a critical assignment in Eastern Europe. The mission required someone with a specific skill set, but there was a problem. Morrison had been flagged by 3 different psychological evaluation boards as potentially unstable following his recent divorce and the death of his son in Afghanistan. Margaret had seen Morrison's file cross her desk 6 months earlier. She remembered him not from his impressive list of commendations, but from a single incident report buried deep in his personnel records. During a training exercise in Georgia, Morrison had risked his own career to report a superior officer who was covering up safety violations that could have killed dozens of soldiers. The report had been quietly buried, the officer transferred, and Morrison's name had been quietly added to what military personnel privately called the troublemaker list. But Margaret had done something that nobody else bothered to do. She had tracked down the soldiers whose lives Morrison had potentially saved. She had interviewed them, their families, and their commanding officers. What she found was a pattern of quiet heroism that never made it into official reports. Morrison didn't just follow orders, he protected people, even when it cost him professionally. Now, as she reviewed the psychological evaluations that threatened to derail his career permanently, Margaret noticed something the evaluators had missed. The timing of Morrison's alleged instability coincided exactly with his reports about the safety violations. Someone had been systematically sabotaging his career for 6 months, using his personal tragedies as cover for professional retaliation. Margaret picked up her secure phone and dialed a number that connected her directly to General Patricia Hayes, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. Hayes was one of the few people who knew the true scope of Margaret's responsibilities. General Hayes, this is Margaret Chun. We need to talk about the Morrison assignment. Chun, thank God you called. I've been getting pressure from 3 different directions to pull him from consideration. The psych evals are damning. With respect, General, the psych evals are compromised. I need 48 hours to document what I've found, but Colonel Morrison isn't the problem here. He's the solution to a much bigger problem that nobody wants to acknowledge. Hayes paused. In her 5 years working with Margaret, she had learned to trust the older woman's instincts completely. Margaret had an uncanny ability to see patterns that others missed, to connect dots that seemed unrelated, and to identify the human element that often determined the success or failure of military operations. You have 24 hours, Hayes said. But, Chun, if you're wrong about this, it's not just Morrison's career on the line. The Secretary of Defense personally asked me to ensure this assignment goes smoothly. Margaret hung up and immediately began the kind of investigation that had made her legendary among the small circle of people who knew what she really did. Most people saw Margaret as a quiet, unremarkable woman who processed paperwork and scheduled meetings. What they didn't see was one of the most sophisticated intelligence analysis operations in the entire military establishment. Margaret had spent decades building a network of contacts that spanned every branch of the military and extended into civilian intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and foreign military establishments. She didn't gather intelligence through dramatic operations or high-tech surveillance. She gathered it through something far more powerful: trust. Over the years, Margaret had helped thousands of military personnel navigate career challenges, family crises, and bureaucratic nightmares. She had connected struggling soldiers with mental health resources, helped families navigate the complexities of military benefits, and quietly intervened when good people were being destroyed by bad systems. In return, these people had become her eyes and ears throughout the military establishment. Within 4 hours, Margaret had assembled a picture that would have taken a formal investigation weeks to develop. Morrison's former commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Kramers, had been systematically targeting soldiers who had reported safety violations or questioned his leadership decisions. Kramers had been transferred from base to base, leaving a trail of damaged careers and compromised operations in his wake. But there was more. Kramers was now serving as a liaison officer with a defense contractor that specialized in training equipment. The same company that had been awarded the contract for the safety equipment that Morrison had identified as defective. The same company that stood to lose millions of dollars if Morrison's original safety report was ever properly investigated. Margaret printed out a single sheet of paper with a phone number and an address. She locked her office and walked to the Pentagon's central courtyard, where she made a phone call on her personal cell phone. "Mr. Morrison, this is Margaret Shun for personnel. I know you don't know me, but I need you to listen carefully. In approximately 6 hours, you're going to receive a call telling you that your security clearance is being revoked pending investigation. When that happens, I need you to immediately contact the number I'm about to give you. This person will provide you with documentation that will protect your career and potentially save the lives of soldiers currently serving overseas." Colonel Morrison was silent for a long moment. "Ma'am, I'm not sure who you are or how you got this number, but, Colonel, 3 months ago you sent a letter to the family of Private First Class Maria Santos, thanking them for their daughter's service and expressing your condolences for her death in a training accident. You didn't know Private Santos personally, but you found out about the accident and took the time to write because you felt responsible for the safety of soldiers under your indirect command. That letter meant everything to her family, and it also told me everything I needed to know about your character." Morrison's voice was tight with emotion when he replied, "How could you possibly know about that letter?" "Because Maria Santos was my great-niece, Colonel, and because I've spent the last 6 months making sure that the people who caused her death don't destroy anyone else's career or family." The line was quiet except for the sound of Morrison's breathing. Finally, he spoke. "What do you need me to do?" Margaret gave him the contact information and hung up. She had set in motion a chain of events that would expose Lieutenant Colonel Kramers, vindicate Morrison, and potentially prevent future tragedies. But more importantly, she had done what she had been doing quietly for 38 years. She had protected good people from bad systems. As she walked back toward her office, Margaret passed a group of young officers discussing their careers and assignments. They didn't notice her, just as thousands of people had failed to notice her over the decades. She was used to being invisible, used to working behind the scenes, used to watching other people receive credit for successes that she had helped engineer. But what Margaret didn't know was that her phone call to Colonel Morrison had been monitored by military intelligence as part of a routine security screening. What she also didn't know was that her name had just appeared on a classified report that would land on the desk of the Joint Chiefs of Staff within hours. Margaret Shun, the invisible woman who had spent nearly 4 decades protecting the military from itself, was about to become very visible indeed. And the recognition that was coming would change not just her life, but the entire way the military understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The first indication that something was different came at exactly 4:30 that afternoon. Margaret was reviewing personnel files when her secure phone rang with a tone she had never heard before. The caller ID showed only a series of numbers that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Ms. Chun, this is General Robert Matthews, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I need to see you in my office immediately." Margaret's hands were steady as she gathered her files, but her mind was racing. In 38 years, she had never been summoned to the chairman's office. She had never even been in the same room as the chairman. Her work was important, but it was invisible by design. She solved problems before they became crises, prevented disasters before they could happen, and protected people before they knew they needed protection. As she walked through the corridors that led to the highest levels of military command, Margaret wondered if her career was about to end in disgrace. Had she overstepped her authority in protecting Colonel Morrison? Had she violated security protocols by using her personal contacts to gather intelligence? Had someone finally decided that a 62-year-old woman with no formal military training had too much influence over military personnel decisions? The outer office of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was unlike anything Margaret had ever seen. The walls were lined with portraits of American military leaders dating back to the Revolutionary War, and the furniture was elegant enough for the White House. The receptionist, a young Marine officer, directed her to a conference room where she was told to wait. Margaret sat in the leather chair and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. She thought about her great-niece Maria, killed in a training accident that could have been prevented. She thought about Colonel Morrison, a good man whose career was being destroyed by corrupt officers. She thought about the thousands of other soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines whose lives she had touched over the years, most of whom never knew her name. If this was the end of her career, Margaret decided, at least she had made a difference. At least she had protected people who deserved protection and exposed problems that needed to be solved. At least she had served something larger than herself, even if that service had always been invisible. The conference room door opened, and Margaret prepared to meet her fate. But what walked through that door was not what she expected at all. It was the beginning of a recognition that was 38 years overdue, and the start of a story that would change how the entire military establishment understood the true meaning of heroism. General Robert Matthews entered the conference room, followed by 4 other officers whose combined rank represented the highest echelons of American military leadership. Margaret recognized 2 of them from photographs: Admiral Sarah Coleman, the Chief of Naval Operations, and General Marcus Thompson, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. The other 2 were unfamiliar, but their bearing and the deference shown to them by the others indicated they were equally important. "Ms. Chun," General Matthews began, his voice carrying a gravity that made Margaret's chest tighten. "Please remain seated. What I'm about to tell you is going to come as a shock." Margaret braced herself for the worst, but Matthews continued in a direction she never expected. 6 months ago, the Department of Defense initiated a comprehensive review of our personnel management systems. We were particularly concerned about retention rates among our most valuable officers and the increasing number of early retirements among personnel with critical skill sets. What we discovered was troubling. Admiral Coleman stepped forward, carrying a thick folder. We found patterns of talented officers leaving the service after encountering what appeared to be insurmountable bureaucratic obstacles. Good people were being destroyed by bad actors, and our traditional oversight systems were failing to identify or address the problems. General Thompson opened his own folder. We established a classified task force to investigate these patterns. What we found was that in virtually every case where a valuable officer was ultimately protected from career destruction, where a corrupt official was exposed and removed, or where a systemic problem was identified and solved before it could cause widespread damage, there was a common factor. Margaret felt her mouth go dry. "Sir, you, Miss Chun." Your name appeared in classified reports, personnel files, and intelligence assessments more than any other individual in the Department of Defense. But here's what troubled us most. Officially, you don't exist. The 4th officer, whom Margaret now realized was wearing the uniform of the Defense Intelligence Agency, spoke for the first time. According to official records, Margaret Chun is a GS-12 administrative specialist assigned to routine personnel processing. Your security clearance is listed as secret level, appropriate for handling basic personnel files. Your supervisor is listed as a deputy director who retired 8 years ago. Your office is officially designated as a supply closet. Margaret felt a wave of confusion wash over her. "I don't understand. I've been reporting to General Hayes for 5 years. General Hayes has no official authority to supervise your position," Admiral Coleman replied. "Because your position doesn't officially exist. Which means that for at least the last 5 years, and possibly much longer, You've been operating completely outside the normal chain of command and oversight structure. General Matthews leaned forward. Ms. Chun, in the last 6 months alone, we have documented 17 instances where your intervention prevented significant harm to military personnel or operations. The Colonel Morrison situation was simply the most recent. But according to our official records, you had no authority to take any of the actions you took, no access to the information you used, and no business involving yourself in any of these situations. Margaret's mind raced back through the years, trying to understand how this had happened. General, I've always had supervisors. I've always followed proper channels. I've always operated within my authority. That's what makes this so remarkable, the DIA officer said. We've traced your career back to 1985. For the first 10 years, everything was normal. You were a secretary, then an administrative assistant, then a junior personnel specialist. But in 1995, something changed. Admiral Coleman opened her folder to a specific page. In November 1995, you prevented what could have been a significant security breach by identifying inconsistencies in the background check of a civilian contractor. Your report was so thorough and your analysis so sophisticated that it caught the attention of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I remember that case, Margaret said quietly. The contractor had been falsifying his employment history. But I was just doing my job. The Deputy Secretary was so impressed that he personally arranged for you to receive additional training and expanded responsibilities. But here's the problem. The Deputy Secretary died of a heart attack 3 weeks later, before the paperwork could be processed. Your expanded role was implemented through verbal orders that were never formally documented. General Thompson continued the story. Over the next several years, as your reputation for solving problems grew, different officials began assigning you additional responsibilities. Each assumed that someone else had the authority to do so. Meanwhile, your official position remained unchanged, creating a situation where you were operating with enormous practical authority, but no formal recognition. Margaret sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she was hearing. Are you saying that for the last 28 years, I've been working without proper authority? We're saying that for the last 28 years, you've been protecting the United States military through a combination of extraordinary skill, unwavering dedication, and what can only be described as bureaucratic invisibility, General Matthews replied. You've become one of the most influential people in the Department of Defense, while remaining completely unrecognized by the very system you've been protecting. The DIA officer pulled out another document. We estimate that your interventions have saved the military approximately $47 million in prevented fraud, avoided lawsuits, and retained personnel. You've identified and helped remove 16 corrupt officials, prevented 11 potential security breaches, and directly influenced the careers of over 3,000 military personnel. Admiral Coleman added, the network of contacts you've built spans every major military installation in the world. Officers and enlisted personnel at every level trust you enough to provide information they wouldn't share with their own commanding officers. You've created an informal intelligence network that rivals anything we have in official channels. Margaret felt overwhelmed. I never intended to operate outside proper channels. I thought I was following orders, doing my job. You were doing your job, General Thompson said. The problem is that your job became much bigger than anyone realized, including you. You've been running what amounts to a one-person military integrity operation for nearly 3 decades. General Matthews stood up and walked to the window. Ms. Chun, we called you here because we need to fix this situation. The military has been unknowingly dependent on your work for years, but that dependence has created vulnerabilities that we can't ignore. What kind of vulnerabilities? Margaret asked. What happens when you retire? Admiral Coleman replied. What happens when you're no longer here to catch the problems before they become crises? What happens when the institutional knowledge you've accumulated over 38 years walks out the door? The DIA officer opened his folder to a chart that made Margaret gasp. We've modeled what the military personnel system would look like without your interventions over the past decade. The conservative estimate is that we would have lost approximately 30% more officers to preventable career destruction, failed to identify major systemic problems until they became public scandals, and missed opportunities to prevent at least 3 significant security breaches. Margaret stared at the chart, seeing her entire career reflected in statistics and projections. I never realized the scope of what I was doing. That's what made you so effective, General Matthews said. You weren't trying to build an empire or advance your own career. You were just trying to help people and solve problems. But the cumulative effect of your work has been extraordinary. General Thompson pulled out a final document, which brings us to why we're here today. The Joint Chiefs, in consultation with the Secretary of Defense and with the knowledge of the President, have decided to formally recognize your contributions to national security. Margaret felt her heart racing. What does that mean? Admiral Coleman smiled for the first time since entering the room. It means, Ms. Chun, that your days of invisibility are over. We're creating a new position specifically designed around the work you've already been doing. The Director of Military Personnel Integrity will be a senior executive service position reporting directly to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, with a staff of 12 and a budget that reflects the true scope and importance of this work. We're offering you the position, General Matthews said, along with formal recognition for 38 years of extraordinary service, including a civilian service award that has only been given to 18 people in the history of the Department of Defense. Margaret sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. After nearly 4 decades of invisible service, she was being offered official recognition and the resources to do her job properly. But there was something else, something that went beyond titles and recognition. For the first time in her career, Margaret was being seen for who she really was and what she had actually accomplished. The work that had defined her life was finally being understood and valued. There's one more thing, the DIA officer said. Your work on the Morrison case exposed a corruption network that extends far beyond what we initially suspected. Lieutenant Colonel Kramers was part of a larger scheme involving defense contractors and compromised officers at multiple installations. Your investigation has given us the foundation for what will likely be the largest military corruption investigation in recent history. Admiral Coleman leaned forward. Ms. Chun, Colonel Morrison isn't the only good officer whose career was nearly destroyed by this network. We estimate that dozens of personnel have been affected over the past several years. Your work may have saved not just individual careers, but the integrity of entire military operations. Margaret thought about Maria Santos, her great-niece who had died in that preventable training accident. She thought about Colonel Morrison and all the other good people whose lives had been damaged by corrupt officials and broken systems. She thought about the 38 years she had spent working in the shadows, protecting people who never knew her name. When would this new position begin? She asked. General Matthews smiled. Immediately, if you accept. But first, there's a ceremony we need to attend. Tomorrow morning, you're going to be formally recognized for your service in front of an audience that includes some very important people who should have known about your work years ago. Margaret felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite identify. Pride, certainly, but also a kind of vindication that went deeper than personal recognition. The work she had done, the people she had protected, the problems she had solved, it had all mattered. It had all been worth it. But more than that, Margaret realized that her story was just beginning. For 38 years, she had worked alone, operating in the shadows with limited resources and no formal support. Now she would have the authority, the resources, and the recognition to make an even greater difference. The Invisible Woman was about to become very visible indeed, and the entire military establishment was about to learn what real service looked like. The Pentagon Auditorium had never felt so imposing to Margaret as it did the next morning. She had walked past this room countless times over the years, occasionally glimpsing important ceremonies and high-level briefings through its doors, but she had never imagined herself as the center of attention within its walls. The auditorium could seat 300 people, and as Margaret peered around the corner from the staging area, she saw that every seat was filled. The audience was unlike any she had ever seen assembled in one place. The front rows were occupied by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, senior cabinet officials, and members of Congress from both parties. Behind them sat an extraordinary collection of military personnel representing every branch of service and spanning ranks from lieutenant to four-star general. What struck Margaret most, however, was the third section of seating, filled with people in civilian clothes whose faces she recognized but had never expected to see in person. Ms. Chun, a young Marine officer, appeared at her elbow. "They're ready for you." Margaret smoothed her navy blue dress, the most formal outfit she owned, and checked her appearance one final time. At 62, she had never been concerned with making a dramatic impression, but today felt different. Today, she represented something larger than herself. As she walked onto the stage, the first thing that struck her was the silence. 300 people, many of whom had spent their careers in situations where they commanded immediate attention and respect, were completely quiet. The second thing she noticed was that every person in military uniform had risen to their feet in a gesture of respect that she had never experienced directed toward her. General Matthews approached the podium with a bearing that commanded the room's complete attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to recognize an individual whose service to our nation has been extraordinary in its impact and remarkable in its modesty. For 38 years, Margaret Chun has worked within our ranks, protecting our people, strengthening our institutions, and safeguarding our mission. Today, we formally acknowledge what many in this room have experienced firsthand. Her service has been indispensable to our success." Margaret took her seat in a chair positioned to face the audience, still struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. In the third row, she spotted Colonel Morrison, his dress uniform crisp and his bearing proud. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded with a respect that conveyed everything words couldn't express. "Ms. Chin's story," General Matthews continued, "illustrates something fundamental about service that we sometimes forget in our focus on rank, title, and formal recognition. True service isn't about the attention it receives or the credit it generates. True service is about the problem solved, the people protected, and the mission advanced, regardless of whether anyone notices." Admiral Coleman approached the podium as General Matthews stepped aside. "I'd like to share some specific examples of Ms. Chin's impact, though I can only discuss a fraction of what we've documented." Margaret watched as Admiral Coleman opened a folder she recognized as containing some of the most sensitive information about her career. She wondered how many people in the audience had been affected by her work without knowing it. In 2018, Ms. Chun identified patterns in personnel transfers that revealed a human trafficking operation involving military families stationed overseas. Her analysis led to the rescue of 23 victims and the arrest of 17 individuals in what became known as Operation Safe Harbor. Ms. Chun received no credit for this work, by her own choice, because she believed that recognition might compromise ongoing investigations. A murmur went through the audience. Margaret remembered that case vividly. Months of painstaking analysis, late nights connecting seemingly unrelated incidents, and the sick feeling in her stomach when she realized what was happening to those families. In 2020, during the early months of the pandemic, Ms. Chun created an informal network to ensure that military families affected by COVID-19 received appropriate support and resources. This network, operating entirely through personal relationships and volunteer coordination, assisted over 1,500 families during the most critical period of the crisis. Again, Ms. Chun sought no recognition and declined several offers of formal commendation. Margaret saw several people in the audience nodding in recognition. She had worked 18-hour days during that period, coordinating with base chaplains, family support groups, and medical personnel to ensure that no military family fell through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. General Thompson took the podium next. Perhaps most remarkably, Ms. Chun has consistently identified and mentored junior personnel who showed exceptional potential but faced obstacles to advancement. Over her career, she has directly influenced the development of 47 officers who now hold positions at the rank of colonel or above, including 3 who now serve as general officers. Margaret was surprised by this statistic. She had always tried to help promising young personnel navigate the complexities of military careers, but she had never tracked the long-term outcomes of these relationships. One of those officers, General Thompson continued, is now serving as the commanding general of our operations in the Pacific Theater. Another leads our most critical cybersecurity initiatives. A third commands our special operations training programs. These leaders shape our national security every day, and their effectiveness can be directly traced to mentorship they received from Ms. Chun early in their careers. The DIA officer who had briefed her the previous day approached the podium with a different kind of folder. Ms. Chen's work has also had significant intelligence value. Her network of relationships throughout the military has provided early warning on security threats, identified potential vulnerabilities in our operations, and facilitated cooperation between agencies that don't traditionally share information effectively. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had never thought of her work in intelligence terms, but she understood how her contacts and relationships had sometimes provided information that proved valuable to military leadership. Most importantly, the officer continued, Ms. Chun has maintained the highest levels of integrity and discretion throughout her career. Despite having access to sensitive information and unofficial influence that could have been exploited for personal gain, she has consistently used her position only to serve others and advance the mission. General Matthews returned to the podium. Today, we're not just recognizing Ms. Chen's past service. We're also announcing the creation of a new office within the Department of Defense that will institutionalize and expand the kind of work she has been doing informally for decades. Margaret knew this was coming, but hearing it announced to this audience made it feel real in a way that yesterday's conversation had not. The Office of Military Personnel Integrity will be responsible for identifying systemic problems in our personnel management systems, protecting good people from bad actors, and ensuring that our most valuable assets, our people, are developed, supported, and retained effectively. Ms. Chun will serve as the first director of this office, with the authority and resources necessary to address these challenges on a scale commensurate with their importance. The audience erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. Margaret saw people throughout the auditorium rising to their feet again, but this time the gesture felt different. It wasn't just respect. It was gratitude from people who understood, perhaps for the first time, how much her work had mattered. But the ceremony wasn't over. General Matthews gestured for quiet and looked directly at Margaret. Ms. Chun, would you please join me at the podium? Margaret stood on unsteady legs and walked to the podium, facing an audience of the most powerful and influential people in American national security. For someone who had spent nearly 4 decades avoiding attention, the moment felt surreal. Ms. Chun, General Matthews said, before we proceed with the formal recognition, I'd like you to know that this ceremony almost didn't happen. Margaret felt a chill of apprehension. When we first proposed formally recognizing your contributions, several people argued that doing so would compromise the effectiveness of your work. They suggested that your power came from your invisibility, and that public recognition would make you less effective. Margaret understood this concern. Much of her influence had come from her ability to operate behind the scenes, to solve problems without creating political complications for the people involved. But then we realized that this perspective, while well-intentioned, missed something fundamental about what you've accomplished. Your effectiveness doesn't come from being invisible. It comes from being trusted. People trust you because you've proven over and over again that you put their welfare and the mission above your own interests. That trust won't diminish because you receive formal recognition. If anything, it will grow stronger. General Matthews turned to face Margaret directly. More importantly, we realized that keeping your work invisible does a disservice to everyone who could learn from your example. The military needs more people who understand service the way you do, not as a path to personal advancement, but as a commitment to something larger than themselves. Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes, something that hadn't happened to her in a professional setting in decades. Ms. Chun, on behalf of the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, and the uniformed leadership of all service branches, I present you with the Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, the highest recognition that can be bestowed upon a civilian employee of the Department of Defense. As General Matthews placed the medal around her neck, Margaret was struck by the weight of it, not the physical weight, but the symbolic weight of recognition that was 38 years in the making. But as she turned to face the audience, Margaret realized that something even more significant was about to happen. In the front row, she saw a figure rising from his seat with a bearing that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. General David Morrison. Not Colonel Morrison, but General Morrison, the four-star general whose brother she had protected years earlier, was walking toward the stage. As he approached, his intention became clear to everyone in the auditorium. The highest-ranking officer in the room was preparing to salute a 62-year-old woman who, until yesterday, had been officially invisible to the very system she had spent her life protecting. The moment that followed would be remembered by everyone present as a perfect illustration of what leadership actually looks like, and why some forms of service transcend every traditional measure of rank, recognition, and authority. General David Morrison's approach to the stage created a ripple of anticipation that spread through the auditorium like electricity. At 58, he was the youngest four-star general in the current military leadership, a man whose reputation for integrity and tactical brilliance had made him one of the most respected officers of his generation. But as he walked toward Margaret Shun, his face carried an expression of deep personal emotion that transcended his professional demeanor. Margaret recognized him immediately, though she had never met him in person. She had studied his career file extensively 8 years earlier, when she was investigating the circumstances that had nearly destroyed his brother's military service. What she had discovered then was a family with a distinguished tradition of military service that had been systematically targeted by the same corruption network that had later threatened Colonel James Morrison. General Morrison stopped 3 feet from Margaret and assumed a position of attention that was crisp enough to be featured in a military training manual. The auditorium fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the ventilation system. Then, with movements that were both precise and deeply respectful, General Morrison rendered a perfect military salute to the civilian woman standing before him. The gesture lasted exactly 4 seconds, but its impact reverberated through the room with the force of an earthquake. Every person in military uniform immediately understood what they were witnessing. The highest form of military respect being paid to someone whose service had transcended traditional boundaries of rank and recognition. As General Morrison lowered his salute, he spoke in a voice that carried clearly throughout the auditorium. "Ms. Chun, 8 years ago, you saved more than my brother's career. You saved my family's honor and preserved a legacy of service that spans 4 generations. Today, I salute not just your individual accomplishments, but the standard of integrity you have set for all of us to follow." The auditorium erupted in sustained applause, but Margaret barely heard it. She was focused on the general's eyes, which conveyed a depth of gratitude that she had never expected to see from someone of his stature and responsibility. But General Morrison wasn't finished. "Ladies and gentlemen, with Ms. Chen's permission, I'd like to share the story of how she changed my family's life, because it illustrates something that every person in this room needs to understand about the true nature of service." Margaret nodded, though she felt exposed in a way that was completely unfamiliar to her. For 38 years, her most meaningful work had been conducted in private, away from scrutiny and recognition. In 2016, my brother James was serving as a lieutenant colonel with what appeared to be a promising career ahead of him. But he had made a decision that would have destroyed most officers. He had reported safety violations by a superior officer, violations that could have killed soldiers during training exercises. General Morrison's voice carried the controlled emotion of someone recounting a story that had deeply affected his family. The retaliation was swift and systematic. James was transferred to increasingly difficult assignments. His efficiency reports were manipulated, and he was subjected to psychological evaluations that questioned his fitness for service. Within 18 months, it appeared that his 20-year career would end in disgrace. Margaret remembered those files vividly. The pattern of retaliation had been obvious to her, but proving it had required months of careful investigation and the cooperation of dozens of people who had risked their own careers to provide information. What James didn't know, and what our family didn't know, was that MS. Chun had identified the pattern of retaliation and was systematically documenting the corruption that threatened to destroy not just his career, but the careers of dozens of other good officers who had committed the crime of putting safety and integrity ahead of blind loyalty. The general paused, looking directly at Margaret. Miss Chun didn't know our family personally. She had no obligation to involve herself in James's situation. But she saw an injustice being perpetrated against a good officer, and she acted to correct it, not because it was her job, but because it was right. Admiral Coleman leaned forward in her seat, clearly invested in the story despite having reviewed the documentation extensively during their investigation. The evidence Ms. Chun compiled didn't just vindicate James. It exposed a corruption network that included a defense contractor, 3 senior officers, and a systematic scheme to retaliate against anyone who threatened their operations. James's safety report, which had been buried and ignored, became the foundation for reforms that prevented future accidents and saved lives. General Morrison turned to address the full audience. But here's what makes Ms. Chen's work remarkable. She could have used the information she gathered for her own advancement. She could have taken credit for exposing the corruption. She could have leveraged her success into recognition and promotion. Instead, she ensured that the credit went to others, that the reforms were implemented quietly, and that good people were protected without fanfare or publicity. Margaret shifted uncomfortably as hundreds of eyes focused on her. She had never sought credit for her work, not out of false modesty, but because she believed that taking credit would compromise her ability to help others in the future. James went on to complete a distinguished military career. General Morrison continued. But, more importantly, the safety reforms that resulted from Ms. Chen's investigation have prevented accidents that could have killed or injured hundreds of soldiers over the past 8 years. This is the true measure of her service, not the problem she solved, but the tragedies she prevented. The general's voice became more personal. For our family, MS. Chen's intervention meant that my brother could retire with honor, that his children could be proud of their father's service, and that our family's tradition of military service could continue. My own son graduated from West Point last spring and is now serving as a second lieutenant in Germany, something that might not have been possible if our family name had been destroyed by false accusations. Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the recognition she was receiving. She thought about the letter she had received from Lieutenant Morrison just 6 months earlier, thanking her for his family's restoration and promising to uphold the standards of integrity that she had helped preserve. General Morrison returned his attention to Margaret. But the most remarkable thing about Ms. Chen's intervention in our family's crisis was that she never told us what she had done. We learned about her role only yesterday, when General Matthews briefed me in preparation for today's ceremony. For 8 years, she allowed us to believe that justice had prevailed through normal channels, that the system had worked as it should. The auditorium was completely silent except for the sound of inhalation and the occasional creak of chairs as people leaned forward to better hear every word. This level of selfless service is rare in any profession and extraordinary in any bureaucracy. Ms. Chen has spent nearly 4 decades protecting the integrity of our military without seeking recognition, advancement, or personal benefit. She has made the institution stronger by making the people within it better. General Morrison stepped closer to Margaret, his voice dropping to a level that was still audible throughout the auditorium, but felt more personal and direct. Ms. Chun, when I learned about your role in saving my brother's career, my first instinct was to find a way to thank you personally and privately. But then I realized that private thanks would miss the point entirely. Your work deserves public recognition, not because you seek it, but because the rest of us need to understand what dedicated service actually looks like. The general gestured toward the audience. Every person in this room has sworn an oath to serve something larger than themselves. Most of us interpret that oath in terms of following orders, completing missions, and advancing our careers within the system. You have interpreted that oath as a commitment to protect the system itself, to make it more effective, and more worthy of the people who serve within it. Margaret found herself thinking about all the people she had helped over the years, all the problems she had solved, all the crises she had prevented. She had never thought of her work in such grand terms, but listening to General Morrison's words, she began to understand how others might view what she had accomplished. The medal you receive today represents formal recognition of your service, General Morrison concluded. But my salute represents something more personal, the gratitude of everyone whose life has been made better by your commitment to doing what is right rather than what is expedient. General Morrison stepped back and saluted Margaret once more, a gesture that was immediately echoed by every person in military uniform throughout the auditorium. The sight of hundreds of officers and enlisted personnel saluting a civilian woman who had never held rank or commanded troops created a moment of pure respect that transcended every traditional boundary of military protocol. As the salutes continued, Margaret realized that something fundamental had changed, not just in her own life, but in the entire room's understanding of what leadership and service meant. The recognition she was receiving wasn't just about her individual accomplishments. It was about the values and principles that had guided her work for 38 years. But even as she stood surrounded by this unprecedented display of respect, Margaret was already thinking about the future. The new office she would lead, the staff she would train, the problems she would solve, and the people she would protect. The recognition was gratifying, but the opportunity to expand her impact was exhilarating. The invisible woman had finally been seen, but more importantly, she had been empowered to make her invisible work visible to everyone who needed to understand how true service was supposed to work. Margaret Chen had spent 38 years proving that the most important work often goes unnoticed. Now she would spend whatever time she had left ensuring that such work would never go unrecognized again. 6 months after the ceremony that changed her life, Margaret Chen stood in the office that bore her nameplate for the first time in 38 years of government service. The Office of Military Personnel Integrity occupied an entire floor of a building adjacent to the Pentagon, with windows that offered a clear view of the Potomac River and modern equipment that Margaret was still learning to use. But the most significant change wasn't the physical space or the formal recognition. It was the team of 12 specialists who had joined her mission, each bringing skills and expertise that complemented her own intuitive understanding of how military bureaucracy really worked. Among them was Dr. Sarah Martinez, a former military psychologist who specialized in organizational behavior, Captain Lisa Wong, a data analyst who had developed algorithms for detecting patterns in personnel files, and Master Sergeant Robert Taylor, a career enlisted man whose network of contacts rivaled Margaret's own. "Ma'am," Captain Wong approached Margaret's desk with a tablet displaying charts and graphs that would have been incomprehensible to her 6 months earlier. "The predictive model is showing concerning patterns in the Pacific Theater. We're seeing indicators that suggest a systematic effort to remove or marginalize officers who have reported cultural sensitivity concerns." Margaret studied the data, her trained eye immediately recognizing patterns that the algorithms had detected but that required human interpretation to understand. "Show me the individual cases behind these statistics." For the next hour, Margaret and her team reviewed files that told a familiar story. Good officers who had identified problems were being systematically punished for their integrity. But this time, instead of working alone with limited resources and no official authority, Margaret had a team of specialists and the full backing of the Department of Defense leadership. "Dr. Martinez," Margaret said, "I want you to conduct psychological evaluations of the officers who were retaliated against. I suspect we'll find that they share certain personality traits that make them targets for this kind of treatment." "Already on it," Dr. Martinez replied. "Preliminary analysis suggests that officers with high moral courage scores are being systematically transferred out of positions where they can influence policy or report problems." Margaret nodded, recognizing the pattern from her own experience. "Captain Wong, expand the data analysis to include family factors. I want to know if officers with spouses in certain professions or children with special needs are being targeted because they're considered less likely to resist unfavorable assignments." "Roger, ma'am," Captain Wong replied, making notes on her tablet. "Should I also look for patterns related to ethnic background and gender?" "Absolutely. Master Sergeant Taylor, I need you to activate our contact network in the Pacific. I want to know what's really happening on the ground, not just what's being reported through official channels. The conversation was interrupted by Margaret's secure phone, which displayed a number she recognized as belonging to General Matthews. In the 6 months since her appointment, she had developed a direct reporting relationship with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that reflected the importance of her office's mission. General Matthews, good afternoon. Margaret, we have a situation developing that requires your immediate attention. I'm sending you a classified file that I need you to review in the next 2 hours. This one's going to test everything we've built together. Margaret felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the most serious cases. Can you give me any context? Senator Rebecca Harrison, chair of the Armed Services Committee, has received allegations that we're systematically discriminating against religious minorities in our promotion processes. She's threatening congressional hearings unless we can provide a comprehensive response within 72 hours. Margaret's mind immediately began processing the implications. Senator Harrison was known for her meticulous approach to oversight and her willingness to pursue issues that other politicians might avoid. If she was threatening hearings, she had evidence that went beyond routine complaints. General, I'll need access to promotion records going back at least 5 years, and I'll need authority to contact personnel directly without going through their chain of command. Done. Margaret, this isn't just about responding to congressional oversight. If these allegations are true, we have a systemic problem that affects thousands of military families and undermines our core values. After ending the call, Margaret gathered her team in the conference room that had become the nerve center for their most complex investigations. The walls were covered with charts, maps, and timelines that reflected ongoing cases, but she directed their attention to the large screen where Captain Wong was already displaying preliminary data. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 72 hours to determine whether the United States military is systematically discriminating against religious minorities in its promotion processes. If we find evidence of discrimination, we'll need to identify the scope of the problem and recommend solutions. If we don't find evidence, we'll need to document our methodology thoroughly enough to satisfy congressional scrutiny. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. Ma'am, even with our resources, analyzing 5 years of promotion data for religious bias is an enormous undertaking. We'll need to establish baseline expectations, identify statistical anomalies, and then investigate individual cases to determine whether the anomalies reflect discrimination or legitimate factors. Margaret understood the challenge, but she also understood the opportunity. This was exactly the kind of systemic investigation that her office had been created to conduct, and success would establish their credibility with both military leadership and congressional oversight. Master Sergeant Taylor, I need you to contact everyone in our network who has served on promotion boards in the last 5 years. I want to know about any guidance they received regarding religious considerations, any pressure they felt to consider non-merit factors, and any cases where they felt religious bias might have influenced decisions. Roger, Mom. Should I also reach out to personnel who were passed over for promotion who might be willing to share their experiences? Margaret paused, considering the sensitivity of direct contact with personnel who might have grievances against the military. Yes, but we'll need to be careful about how we approach them. Captain Wong, can you identify patterns in the promotion data that might suggest religious bias? And then we'll use those patterns to identify specific individuals to interview. For the next 18 hours, Margaret's team worked with an intensity that reminded her of her early years as a solitary investigator, but with resources and authority that magnified their effectiveness exponentially. Captain Wong's algorithms identified statistical anomalies that would have taken Margaret months to discover working alone. Dr. Martinez conducted psychological profiles that revealed patterns of bias that were subtle but consistent. Master Sergeant Taylor's network provided insights from promotion boards and effective personnel that painted a picture of institutional practices that had evolved over years without formal oversight. By the end of the first day, Margaret had assembled evidence that confirmed Senator Harrison's allegations while revealing a problem that was both more complex and more solvable than anyone had initially understood. Religious discrimination wasn't the result of deliberate policy decisions, but rather the cumulative effect of unconscious bias, inadequate training, and promotion processes that relied too heavily on subjective evaluations from supervisors who had never been educated about the importance of religious diversity. But Margaret's investigation had also revealed something encouraging. The vast majority of military personnel, when presented with clear evidence of bias, were eager to correct it. The problem wasn't widespread malice, but rather institutional blindness to patterns that had developed gradually over time. Margaret's report to General Matthews was delivered exactly 71 hours after his phone call, and it included not just documentation of the problems, but a comprehensive plan for addressing them. The plan included mandatory training for all promotion board members, revised evaluation criteria that emphasized objective performance measures, and ongoing monitoring systems that would identify bias patterns before they could affect large numbers of personnel. 2 weeks later, Margaret sat in a congressional hearing room as Senator Harrison questioned General Matthews about the military's response to discrimination allegations. But instead of the defensive, damage control testimony that often characterized such hearings, Margaret watched as the general presented her office's findings and recommendations with confidence and transparency. Senator Harrison, General Matthews said, "We discovered that your allegations were not only accurate, but actually understated the scope of the problem. However, we also discovered that the military's institutional capacity for self-correction, when properly directed and resourced, exceeds what any of us had previously understood." Senator Harrison, clearly surprised by the directness of the response, leaned forward. "General, are you telling me that you not only found evidence of discrimination, but that you're confident in your ability to address it systematically?" "Yes, ma'am. And I'm confident because our investigation was conducted by an office specifically designed to identify and solve these kinds of institutional problems before they require congressional intervention." Senator Harrison's questions continued for another hour, but her tone shifted from confrontational to genuinely curious about how the military had developed such a sophisticated approach to self-oversight and institutional improvement. After the hearing, General Matthews found Margaret in the hallway outside the committee room. "Margaret, 6 months ago, the hearing would have been a disaster for the military. We would have been defensive, unprepared, and reactive. Instead, we were proactive, transparent, and solution-focused. That transformation is directly attributable to the office you've built." Margaret felt the satisfaction that came from work well done, but she also felt the weight of responsibility for maintaining the standards they had established. "General, we've proven that the concept works, but we've also raised expectations for how the military should respond to institutional challenges. We can't afford to become complacent." "Agreed. Which is why I'm recommending that Congress fund an expansion of your office to include liaison positions at every major command. The model you've developed needs to be replicated throughout the military establishment." As Margaret walked back to her office that afternoon, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from an invisible secretary to the director of an office that was transforming military personnel management. The recognition she had received was gratifying, but the impact she was having was extraordinary. But more importantly, Margaret had proven something that she had believed for 38 years, but had never been able to demonstrate at scale. The military could be made better by people who were committed to making it more effective and more worthy of the men and women who served within it. Margaret Shin had spent the first 38 years of her career proving that one person could make a difference by working invisibly within the system. She would spend the rest of her career proving that a team of dedicated professionals with proper authority and resources could transform the system itself. The woman who had been ignored by everyone in the room until a 4-star general saluted her had become the architect of institutional change that would affect military families for generations to come. Her story was no longer just about individual recognition, but about the power of principled leadership to create lasting positive change in even the largest and most complex organizations. Margaret Shun had finally become visible, and the military establishment would never be the same.